Hello, everyone. Uh, this is Marx and Philosophy, session 3, right?
3, yes.
Held by Ray Brassier. And now I'm gonna pass the mic to Ray.
Okay, hi. So I think I need to unmute myself. Do I need to Can everyone hear me? Yep, okay. So did everyone receive the handout for today, which I sent just a couple of minutes ago? Yep. Okay, good. Okay, and then I think I see David's just asked a question here. Will we be focusing on volume 1 of Capital or 3? Basically, volume 1, and then a brief, possibly a brief extract from volume 3. So we'll spend a long time on the section on the commodity form in volume 1. But yeah, I'm afraid, yeah, again, it'll be a very kind of compressed discussion of Capital. And I think that'll be in a couple of weeks, I think. So today, yes, just quickly one thing. Last week, I asked everyone to kind of introduce themselves, and just so we can kind of get to know each other. But I know that I think 2 people joined for the first time last week. Did anyone who didn't kind of introduce themselves last week? I think it was maybe David and Bruce. Is that correct? Okay, so Bruce and David, would you mind just quickly introducing yourselves to the class, just so just very briefly, just kind of tell us just tell us what you're doing and what your interests are, basically. You can do it in the text if you want, sure, yes.
I'll go first here, just so I can also respond to what Bruce is talking about. So that echo effect comes from the fact that Ray sometimes has to do with Ray's mute, I think, right? Like, so that's why people mute Ray, but then right afterwards he's got to unmute himself if he wants to talk. But I'm not hearing it right now. So wait, oh, it's because my computer is muted. So is there an echo? Everyone hear me just fine?
Yep.
Cool. So I'll just say a couple of things. I'm an adjunct instructor at Boise State University in Idaho, in South Idaho, working on my master's degree. I wasn't planning on getting a master's at Boise State, but it just worked out that way because I'm more interested in experimental alternative living learning communities. And so I'm involved with one here in Boise, and that's what I do. My degree is in cultural criticism and design, and I teach a course on climate change for freshmen here. And I don't know, it seems like Marx is one of the most relevant things for me to be studying right now. So thanks for having me.
Okay, very good, thanks. Okay, yeah, and Bruce, well, actually, I mean, maybe, yeah, everyone can see Bruce's little text. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Thanks, thanks, Bruce. Okay, so good. Now let's.
Should I do an intro thingy as well?
Oh yes, sorry, Ian. Yes, no, sorry. Yes, by all means, yes.
Maybe as well. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm on the phone here. Excellent. So, I did my BA in philosophy. Pretty much did a master's in a program called Aesthetics and Politics, which was contemporary philosophy and critical theory. And I have this really vexed relationship right now with navigating between being interested in digital art and being a digital artist of sorts and working within philosophy and incorporating that into my work. I find that when I get too heavy into the philosophy, my mind gets sucked in and the institutional system sucks you in really deep and you don't have time. And then when I get too heavy into the arts, I find I'm not digging into the philosophy enough. So I'm really interested in trying to create a practice where I can really work heavily within both fields and incorporate them through some kind of digital interactive installation work. And the trajectory of philosophy that spawned, I suppose, from, Kant, Hegel, Feuerbach, Marx, and forward into the present, and the way it's influencing you, Ray, and many other people's work is really just important to me to dig into and better understand and put into practice, whether it's an art practice or some kind of socially relevant practice where images become powerful on a political level. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Great. Okay, right, okay, so let's kick off today's session. Now, I think last week, last week, I think we ended, discussing relationship between, ideology and productive forces and social relations. And okay, one of the things I want to suggest in terms of what Marx is doing vis-a-vis kind of traditional philosophy is, transforming the classical metaphysical understanding relationship between the sensible and the intelligible. Or if you want, the relationship between the sensible and the supersensible, which is inaugural for philosophy. And what I think, one of the things he's doing, if one understands what his concept of the sensuous is, as kind of inspired by Feuerbach, then I think that Marx's kind of most radical proposal is that whereas in philosophy it's the sensible that appears and the intelligible that is inapparent, okay, that somehow transcends the realm of the sensible, Marx carries out an inversion. So for Marx, it's actually the intelligible which appears and which is the element of social self-consciousness. Whereas the sensible is precisely what is invisible or inapparent from the vantage point of ideological representation. In other words, spontaneous consciousness or thinking systematically misrepresents or occludes the sensuous forces and relations that condition its own cognitive activity. So I think that's the first thing in Marx. So when Marx, for Marx, the sensuous is a domain of social production and reproduction. But this is exactly what is inapparent, what is inapparent to ordinary social consciousness, which is ideologically, enveloped, so to speak. So that social consciousness is necessarily misrepresents social reality. So that's, and therefore that's why for Marx, the political economy is ideological through and through, because political economy can only perceive the sensuous reality of social production through this ideological lens, which inverts and distorts its veritable character. So already here in the economic and philosophical manuscripts and German ideology, he's setting out his critique of political economy, And what he has to do is, first of all, he has to kind of distinguish between, in a way, you know, the sensuous real and the what is ideologically ideal, in order to kind of to frame his you know, his critical task vis-a-vis classical political economy, because the categories in terms of which political economy has sought to understood society or social reality are themselves are just simply kind of ideological projections. So here in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, we see him trying to kind of you know, not begin by taking phenomena like property, you know, property, money, exchange, you know, he as you know, as simply given, you know, as pre-existent determinations. He wants to kind of find a relation, a relational nexus that generates these categories. And for him, it's going to be labor. So for him, labor or productive activity is what generates property, class, money, etc., etc., and all the categories with which classical political economy usually begins, without asking for their how they've come to be generated. And I think this interest in the conditions of genesis, the conditions of generation, is, you know, important when one understands what Marx means by critique, and what he means by the critique of political economy. He wants to be able to show how the categories of political economy can have objective purpose, how they can be about the reality they claim to be describing. But his intervention consists in demonstrating that they presuppose a reality that they occlude, that they hide or dissimulate, and that's the reality of labor. So we'll begin. So it's also in this, you know, this early stage that Marx talks the category of alienation is fundamental to Marx's analysis. Now, this category, I think, is one that Marx inherits from Hegel via Feuerbach. And the term, you know, in both Marx and Feuerbach are kind of Hegelians in a kind of a large sense. And in Hegel, we have to understand that the word, what is ordinarily translated as alienation in Hegel's text, actually comprises two aspects, which is the aspect of externalization, which is, the German word is Entäußerung, and the aspect of estrangement, which corresponds to the German Entfremdung. And the point is that it's important to be aware that externalization and estrangement, in a way, it's not that they're not two different things, but they are two distinct facets of you know, a movement. In Hegel, it's the, you know, it's consciousness that, you know, externalizes and estranges itself, whereas in Marx, it's going to be labor or productive activity. So Marx begins his account in the EPM with, he wants to, you know, the point of intervention for the critique of political economy will be what he calls the basic fact of political economy, which is that, you know, as he puts it, the worker becomes poorer the richer is his production, or the more it increases in power and scope. The worker becomes a commodity that is all the cheaper the more commodities he creates. The depreciation of the human world progresses in direct proportion to the increase in value of the world of things. Labor does not only produce commodities, it produces itself and the laborer as a commodity, and that to the extent to which it produces commodities in general. And what this fact expresses is merely this: the object that labor produces, its product, confronts it as an alien being, as a power independent of the producer. The product of labor is a labor that has solidified itself into an object, made itself into a thing, the objectification of labor. The realization of labor is its objectification. In political economy, this realization of labor appears as a loss of reality for the worker, an objectification as a loss of the object or slavery to it, an appropriation as alienation, as externalization. Political economy hides the alienation in the essence of labor by not considering the immediate relationship between the worker or labor and production. So Marx's analysis then is going to kind of distinguish four facets of the alienation of labor. First, the alienation of the product, the alienation of production, the alienation of species being, and then the alienation of worker and owner, or the laborer and the capitalist. So we're going to try to kind of just recapitulate how he distinguishes between these four. So first of all, there's an alienation of the worker or the producer from his product. The producer is alienated from her product. This is number 2 on the handout. The worker puts his life into the object, and this means that it no longer belongs to him, but to the object. So the greater this activity, the more the worker is without an object. What the product of his labor is, that he is not. So the greater this product, the less he is himself. The externalization of the worker in his product implies not only that his labor becomes an object, an exterior existence, but also that it exists outside him, independent and alien, and becomes a self-sufficient power opposite him, that the life that he has lent to the object affronts him as hostile and alien. So now, a couple of things that are worth, I think, emphasizing here is that obviously that throughout this account, Marx is talking about wage labor, and he's talking about commodity producing labor. And there's a complicated question to ask about whether how this kind of the alienation of labor originally occurs. If we understand that for Marx, although all alienation presupposes externalization, not all externalization is alienating. And it's important that, in a way, because remember that Marx's materialism emphasizes practical activity. So what he's saying is that labor is a mode of the fundamental modality of practical activity. But presumably he seems to be suggesting that not all productive activity is necessarily alienating. So it's the conditions under which this productive activity becomes alienated are what his account needs to explain. The other distinction that's important here, and it only becomes fully ratified in Capital, is between use-producing labor and value-producing labor. So all all practical activity is an externalization. It produces something, and what it produces is something that is useful, something that is, that has a function for human life. But it's only under the conditions of generalized commodity production, or a commodity, an economy and a society structured around commodity exchange, that the useful products of labor are subordinated to value. In other words, that use-creating labor is subordinated to value-generating labor. So the distinction between externalization and estrangement corresponds to the distinction between use-creating labor and value-generating labor. But this distinction is not yet formalized in Marx's accounts at this stage, but it's being prefigured in a sense. But what he means basically is that the labor who produces commodities does not own the commodities that he or she has produced, precisely because he or she has to sell her labor power in order to produce commodities that are themselves exchangeable, or that will are produced in order to be sold. But okay, that's just let's get back to the what Marx calls the immediate relationship between the producer, the production, and the product. So in quote number 3, Marx writes, the immediate relationship of labor to its product is a relationship of the worker to the objects of his production. So if the product of labor is externalization, production itself must be active externalization, the externalization of activity, the activity of externalization. The alienation of the object of labor is only the resume of the alienation or the externalization in the activity of labor itself. So in other words, here he seems to be saying that the alienation of the product of labor presupposes the alienated character of production as such. In other words, if the product of labor is, if the labor is alienated from her product, it's because her productive activity is also alienated. And for Marx, the alienation of production, or the alienation of this productive activity, is attested to by the fact that, as he puts it, in the conditions of capitalism, labor is exterior to the worker. That is, it does not belong to his essence. Therefore, he does not confirm himself in his work. He denies himself, feels miserable instead of happy, deploys no free physical and intellectual energy, but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. Thus, the worker only feels a stranger. He is at home when he is not working, and when he works, he is not at home. His labor is therefore not voluntary, but compulsory, forced labor. It is therefore not the satisfaction of a need, but only a means to satisfy needs outside itself. Here, again, this sounds a little bit perplexing unless one remembers that what Marx means is that commodified labor, the commodity producing labor is also a commodity. It's already commodified. In other words, the labor that produces commodities is itself a commodity, which is sold to the employer, the capitalist, for a wage. And what underlies this, so this is a kind of an alienation of labor, understood as productive activity, because here the goal of productive activity is no longer immanent and intrinsic to that activity. In other words, what is the goal of this production is not something that is determined by the activity itself. It's not something that is, as Marx puts it, freely chosen or selected by the producer. And this is, in other words, the labor is obliged to work in order to live. You don't, the activities, the productive activities that the labor engages in are not chosen, are not selected according to needs and interests that he or she has, has chosen or desires, but they are imposed upon them by social conditions. So in other words, that we have to work in order to live. And so that when we are, when we're working, we feel as if we are, what it is we're doing and what it is we're producing is something over which we have no control, in a sense. So now these are the two aspects, alienation of the product and alienation of the productive activity. And then Marx writes, this is number 5 on the handout. So Marx writes, so we have treated the active alienation of practical human activity or labor from two aspects. One, the relationship of the worker to the product of his labor as an alien object that has power over him. This relationship is at the same time the relationship to the sensuous exterior world and to natural objects as to an alien and hostile world opposed to him. And two, the relationship of labor to the act of production inside labor. This relationship is the relationship of the worker to his own activity as something that is alien and does not belong to him. It is activity that is passivity, power that is weakness, procreation that is castration, the worker's own physical and intellectual energy, his personal life, for what is life except activity, as an activity directed against himself, independent of him and not belonging to him. It is self-alienation, as above it was the alienation of the object. Now, again, what Marx is not kind of in the background of this whole account is, but the fundamental question that Marx hasn't raised yet is what, under what social conditions does the productive activity, which is fundamental to human existence, become estranged from itself in this way. This estrangement has a third aspect, which is that it's an estrangement or an alienation from human species being, which Marx defines as free conscious activity. This is number 6. While alienated labor alienates one nature from man and man from himself, his own active function, his vital activity, it also alienates the species from man. It turns his species life into a means towards his individual life. Firstly, it alienates species life and individual life. And secondly, in its abstraction, it makes the latter, i.e. individual life, into the aim of the former, i.e. species life, which is also conceived of in its abstract and alien form. For firstly, work, vital activity, and productive life itself appear to man only as a means to the satisfaction of a need, the need to preserve his physical existence. But productive life is species life. It is life producing life. The whole character of a species, its generic character, is contained in its manner of vital activity. And free conscious activity is the species characteristic of man. Life itself appears merely as a means to life. And here, the footnote here is the long quotation, which we actually looked at last week from the EPM, from the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, about where Marx talks about the relationship between the human relationship to species life and the animal relation to species life, and nature as man's inorganic body. But here, I think the point he's making in number 6 is that when you have to work in order to live, life is estranged from itself. Okay, and it's strange because this estrangement is symptomatic of a split between one's individual activity, the activities in which one engages as an individual, and the activities which are characteristic of one's species being. It's a split between essence and existence in philosophical terminology. This means that whereas species activity is an end in itself, productive activity is in a way kind of autotelic or self-governing. Once this alienation unfolds, then there's the goals for which we work and the goals that we're trying to satisfy in our labor are themselves merely means to an end, which is simply kind of survival or reproduction. Life appears merely as a means to life, as opposed to being an end in itself. So that's the third aspect. Now here, I'll skip up now. 7, 8, and 9 are Marx are important because in a way they're Marx elaborating on what he thinks is the fundamental difference between human vital activity and animal vital activity. And in number 7 he says it's human vital activity is not immediately identical to any of his characterizations. Conscious vital activity differentiates man immediately from animal vital activity. It is this and this alone that makes man a species being. He is only a conscious being, that is, his own life is an object to him, precisely because he is a species being. And this is the only reason for his activity being free activity. So the word free, the invocation of free conscious activity recurs frequently in these early texts.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
So it seems sometimes I'm confused about the different ways Marx uses the term consciousness, because like in the German ideology, for example, so sometimes he's obviously denigrating consciousness kind of as and identifying it with ideology and superstructure, and but in cases like this it sounds like he's sort of positing a more essential relationship between consciousness and productive activity as such. And I'm wondering how those two notions of consciousness fit together for him.
Okay. It's a very good question. I think there's two. Okay, I think the term activity is crucial here. I think he distinguishes between active consciousness, which he thinks is, involved in all practical activity. All practical activity for Marx is conscious activity, as doing something, and consciousness as contemplation, or as the passive registration or representation of some kind of distinct or external reality. So I think in a way, remember in his critique of Feuerbach, he's saying that even Feuerbach hasn't gone far enough in reintegrating consciousness and sensual life or sensual being. And what he means by that is that philosophers have artificially kind of privileged theoretical consciousness or a kind of, if you want, a kind of, knowing that, theoretical consciousness or representation, or knowing that things are thus and so, over what I think he would kind of characterize as a kind of practical consciousness, or kind of knowing how, or making or doing. So in other words, so for Marx, there's a consciousness which human beings are conscious in the sense that everything human beings, all the activities that human beings engage in are conscious activities. And they're conscious activities because they are social activities, which means that they are not instinctual. I think this is absolutely fundamental for Marx, isn't that he thinks that social activities involve the producing useful things, making and doing things that are not simply kind of determined by biological needs. So consciousness is involved in practical social activity because it involves selecting and, in a way, kind of engineering, selecting goals and engineering means to satisfy those goals, which are not simply mechanically determined by human biology or physiology. So I think that's the consciousness in this sense just means, consciousness is always necessarily accompanies practical social activity for him. But then there's another sense of consciousness, which is consciousness, consciousness as ideological, which is merely, he thinks, in a way which is kind of blind to its own social practical preconditions, and in a way, understands itself and its world, or represents its world in a way which occludes the practical productive aspect of its own practical productive preconditions. So I think, it's not, that's one way in which I think Marx would, I guess, ratify this distinction, or in a way that kind of, the positive and the negative sense of consciousness. So free conscious activity is characteristic of human species being, because what human beings do, the activities that human beings do, they are self-generated. Human beings are engaged in executing tasks that they have fixed for themselves socially. And by this, he simply means that they are not simply, that these ends are not biologically determined. But freedom, but in a sense, this freedom has never been properly realized. So in a way, the point about communism is that only communism can realize free conscious activity, because every social formation hitherto has, in a way, it kind of, it presupposes, it decouples, instinct from, from voluntary, or intentional activity. But there's always a residual automatism, or, that there's a kind of a social, reinstatement of the mechanical or the automatic, because of the ways in which human beings, because human productive activity is self-estranged and generates social arrangements which inhibits the definitive realization of this free conscious activity. Does this?
Thanks. Yeah, that helps a lot. It has one quick follow-up kind of to that is the version of consciousness, of free autonomous activity, of productive force, is a pretty like robust thing, and I'm interested in how he feels justified in kind of positing it, as opposed to something like the way Hegel attempts to derive it, from a sort of presuppositionless beginning. I mean, I get he sort of associates that kind of Hegelian move with the other kind of consciousness, sort of ideological, but like there's still something fuzzy to me about his sense of how I guess what right, quid juris or whatever, what right he has to define conscious, not correct activity in this way.
Yes. Okay, that's very good. Okay, so now we're getting. I mean, this is, I think, a debate. Really, this is why, in a way, those kind of Marxists who want to say kind of, for instance, Althusserians, but not only Althusserians, will want to say that there's, in a way, that the young Marx is still too philosophical. In a way, the way in which he, if he's simply positing this kind of free conscious activity as coextensive with social production, and as the kind of the sine qua non for all other kind of cognition, then it still seems to be like a metaphysical move or a dogmatic move, and the danger here, and it's true that it does this, in a way, the kind of it's this young Marx here, in a way, he almost invites a metaphysical temptation to say that the essence that man is basically a producer. That you simply say that the essence of being human is to produce, but to produce, freely and consciously, as opposed to produce in accordance with physical or biological kind of mechanisms. But this would still be a completely metaphysical characterization of species being or human essence, which is why when it comes by the time it comes to capital, I think Marx, in a way, the kind of the activity, the dimension of the distinction between use creating labor and value creating labor is itself only kind of can only be elaborated from the vantage point of an analysis of capital and of in fact that all labor is itself value generating labor is already kind of subsumed by the value form, is already kind of commodified, and use creating labor, which is labor that is no longer subordinated, to the wage relation and no longer subordinated to the production of commodities, would be, it's impossible to give a positive characterization of it because there are no ends, there are no uses in themselves. Okay, if all the uses created by human labor are socially mediated, depend on historically variable conditions, then it's impossible to specify a domain of use in itself. Okay, which means that Marx can't specify the distinction between use creating labor and value creating labor, in terms of, he can't give a positive characterization of what labor is, or the uses that can be confidently distinguished from mere commodified values. Okay, and this is where, and I think this, in Capital, this is why Marx doesn't believe in, it's not as if he's saying that there is a kind of, you can read off, the purposes, the functions, and the uses, which are proper to human labor. Okay, there's no, if you did that, if you naturalize use or function, you're making a metaphysical move. And I think this is the danger that Marx has to kind of stave off. And I think in a way he's bringing in species being here. When he talks about man produces universally, what he means is that human productive capacity is not biologically or even kind of, it's not economically constrained. He's saying that this is the characteristic of human productive capacity, is that there's nothing that human beings can't engineer or generate, because they have they can, in a way, mime all the kind of the forms of expertise exhibited by other species. Now, but at this stage, he still has to, as you just pointed out, that claim sounds very metaphysical. It just sounds as if this is just a stipulation. The claim that man produces universally seems to be just like a kind of a metaphysical stipulation. And I think what Marx has to say in order to make this not be a metaphysical claim is that with capitalism, human productive capacity has reached a stage where human beings can transform nature and can transform themselves. In other words, it's in a way, it's kind of, it dissolves all hitherto established horizons of possibility for productive functioning. So in other words, what human beings, human productive capacity comes into its own and is, because it's socialized under the conditions of capital and private property, but nevertheless it's socialized in a way which opens up, which in a way kind of implies in negative this universal productive capacity. So this is why I think that this is a sense in which I think capitalism and the capitalist mode of production is the precondition for the communist mode of production. And this is also why the communist mode of production can't be positively characterized, because it can only be negatively anticipated, because we can't yet imagine what productive potencies will be realized once we abolish the capital relation, the commodity form, and wages, etc., etc. So I think you put your finger on a crucial issue here. So that what is still at this stage in Marx, what's still, in a way, he has to kind of use a quasi-metaphysical vocabulary. But I think he knows, I think it's a mistake to think that he is committing himself metaphysically. I think he hasn't yet kind of worked out all the kind of the analytical resources he needs to be able to make the point he wants to make without this kind of metaphysical rhetoric. So I think that's what, that's my kind of, interpretation.
That's very helpful.
Okay, so just, yes, so 8 and 9 are basically reiterating this point about, man producing universally. So this alienation of, the alienation of the individual from the species, or in a way that in a way it's also the kind of the alienation of particular purposes, particular functions and purposes from species functions and purposes. So number 4 is the final. So we've had the alienation of the product, alienation of production, alienation of the individual and the species, and finally number 4, the alienation of worker and employer, alienation of man from man. In other words, the fundamental class stratification. So at number 10, Marx writes, So alienated labor makes a species being of man, both nature and the intellectual faculties of his species, into a being that is alien to him, into a means for his individual existence. It alienates from man his own body, nature exterior to him, and his intellectual being, his human essence. 4, an immediate consequence of man's alienation from the product of his work, his vital activity, and his species being, is the alienation of man from man. When man is opposed to himself, it is another man that is opposed to him. What is valid for the relationship of a man to his work, of the product of his work and himself, is also valid for the relationship of man to other men and of their labor and the objects of their labor. Then he continues in number 11. So the alien being to whom the labor and the product of the labor belongs, whom the labor serves and who enjoys its product, can only be man himself. If the product of labor does not belong to the worker, but stands over against him as an alien power, this is only possible in that it belongs to another man apart from the worker. And if his activity torments him, it must be a joy and a pleasure to someone else. This alien power above man can be neither the gods nor nature, only man himself. Consider further the above sentence that the relationship of man to himself first becomes objective and real to him through his relationship to other men. So if he relates to the product of his labor, his objectified labor, as to an object that is alien, hostile, powerful, and independent of him, this relationship implies that another man is the alien, hostile, powerful, and independent master of this object. If he relates to his own activity as to something unfree, it is a relationship to an activity that is under the domination, oppression, and yoke of another man. Okay. So what Marx is trying to do is deducing the 4 kind of the facets of kind of a capitalist or commodity producing society. Alienation of the product, alienation of the activity, alienation of, in a way, alienation of means and ends. Because that's what the alienation of species being implies. And finally, the alienation of, in a way, the social relation itself, because human beings, because now the labor is producing something that belongs to someone else. Because both the laborer's productive activity and the product of that activity are owned by someone who isn't engaged in that, in producing anything. And so Marx's claim now is that private property is a product of alienated labor, so that it's only through this estrangement of labor from itself that private property is generated. So he writes in 12, through alienated labor, man creates not only his relationship to the object in active production as to alien and hostile men, he creates too the relationship in which other men stand to his production and his product, and the relationship in which he stands to these other men. And again, he writes, the relationship of the worker to his labor creates the relationship to it of the capitalist, or whatever else one wishes to call the master of the labor. Private property is thus the product, result, and necessary consequence of externalized labor, of the exterior relationship of the worker to nature and to himself. Now this is, now there's a couple of things. This is a puzzling passage, actually. And if one thinks about the logic of Marx's account, it becomes a little bit kind of baffling. Because what he's saying here is that alienated labor creates private property. But then at the same time, it seems that private property is a precondition for the alienation of labor. In other words, because the condition under which the laborer sells his labor to another human in order to produce a commodity that from whose sale the capitalist will derive a profit. Well, it seems that this already presupposes the institution of private property, and in a sense, the question is, how is it that the capitalist is able to own both the product and the productive activity of the laborer? How is the capitalist able to kind of, to buy this activity and its products? And this is something that is, and I think this is, something that will, I think, only becomes really kind of explicit in Capital. The point is that the labor that is being sold to the capitalist is already a property. It's already an item of property, and in fact, it's, as Marx will put it, it's what the what the worker is selling to the capitalist is her labor power. Her labor power therefore becomes commodified in the wage relation. But it seems that the conditions. So the question is, don't the conditions of commodification already presuppose the institution of private property? And if so, how can labor be the precondition for private property? And I think what's going on here, in order to kind of, I think the distinction between externalization and estrangement can be useful here, because I think the claim is that so labor, all productive activity is an externalization, but this under certain kind of social conditions, this externalization gives rise to a social relation in which what is produced or generated by this activity is estranged from it, and the estrangement, must. The question is, how does externalization generate its own estrangement or its own self-estrangement? And this is the question about the genesis of the capital relation. The capital relation being the relationship between the capitalist and the worker. The capitalist who owns the means of production, and the worker who only owns her labor power as the only commodity she has to sell. And therefore it's under these conditions that in a way the laborer is obliged to sell her labor power in order to live, because you have to work, you have to sell your labor power in order to be able to live, and in order to be able to kind of to do anything else. So I think that Marx is saying that this, in a way, that the logic of Marx's account implies understanding how externalization creates an object or a set of objects which then prevent this productive activity, this externalizing activity, from being autonomous. Okay, it becomes heteronomous. It becomes subordinated to extrinsic or alien purposes. But what's unclear here is how, or at least in quotation number 12, it's how, yeah, in a way, the kind of the wage relation must already be in place in order for this, you know, the self-estrangement of productive activity to occur. And what we need, so the question is it actually possible? In other words, if a metaphysical reading of Marx, I think, would understand this, would try to kind of understand this relationship causally, okay, in terms of externalization causing its own estrangement. But I think there is no causal relationship here. I think the conditions under which externalization becomes self-estranging presuppose an entire system of social relations of which labor is only a component. Okay, so in other words, I think that if you try to make labor, you know, the ultimate generating force, in a way, the ultimate determinant for all the other kind of for the nature of productive forces, but also for social relations and things like property and money, etc. You run into, well, the risk is that you can't but turn it into a metaphysical power. And I think that's part of what the, but when Marx comes to write Capital, he understands that labor cannot be abstracted entirely from the capital relation, and that the unestranged labor, or labor that, or autotelic labor, you know, which, you know, sets its own ends, is something that can only be negatively characterized. It's merely a shadow cast by the wage relation, which is subsumed, you know, which is a function of the value form at this stage. So I think, so in other words, I think that the metaphysical temptation is to think that labor generates its own self-estrangement in and by itself. But if you did that, I think you'd end up with a completely an idealist account, you know, kind of a metaphysical account. And I think in order to understand the relationship between use creating, you know, let's say free productive activity and alienated labor, you need to understand how the relationship is mediated by value, where value is something that isn't, in a way, that is generated by you know, a system of activities, not which can't be in a way, which can't be classified as labor. So what? Okay, let me simplify this. What I'm saying in a very roundabout sense is that I think that Marx will continue to say that kind of productive activity generates capital, the capital relation, value, money, commodities, class, etc. But the way in which it generates them can be understood if you abstract labor from its relation to value. In other words, so it's a mistake to turn labor into a kind of into a self-generating or self-moving principle, or to absolutize labor, basically. So in other words, so what I think that essence is not that labor is not the essence of human existence for Marx. And I think that the productive capacities that he thinks are distinctive of human beings, in a way, can't even be adequately characterized in terms of labor, because labor itself is an abstraction, and the temptation is to reify it and to turn it into this force, into this kind of force or agency, which is invariant, through human history. And I think that this is what Marx wants to kind of avoid doing. Anyway, so this is I apologize. I mean, this is not, it's not as clear as it could have been, but I think that, so Marx wants to put labor at the center of the analysis. He wants to show how, property and class are consequences of productive activity or labor. But at this stage, I think he doesn't have all the kind of the conceptual resources he needs to be able to do that properly. And the danger is that you end up absolutizing labor as this kind of force, as this metaphysical force, which in a way which becomes estranged from itself, and then returns into itself and achieves its full potency in communism. And I think if you read Marx in that way, then this is the classical metaphysical reading of Marx, which I think lots of critics, lots of Marxists have criticized. In a way, it's how not to understand the logic of externalization and estrangement. Because all you're doing then is you're simply taking, you're replacing, a metaphysically conceived consciousness with a metaphysically conceived labor, which I think is not the good way to understand Marx. Okay, now I'm just going to go on to, yes, wage labor is alienated labor. The contradiction, so in number 13, Marx writes, political economy starts from labor as the veritable soul of production, and yet it attributes nothing to labor and everything to private property. Proudhon has drawn a conclusion from this contradiction that is favorable to labor and against private property, but we can see that this apparent contradiction is the contradiction of alienated labor with itself, and that political economy has only expressed the laws of alienated labor. We can therefore also see that wages and private property are identical. For wages, in which the product, the object of the labor, remunerates the labor itself, are just a necessary consequence of the alienation of labor. Wages are an immediate consequence of alienated labor, and alienated labor is the immediate cause of private property. Now, it's this, I think that the term immediate cause is problematic here, and I think it's not clear that it's the appropriate expression to use at this stage. But the simple point is simply that the wage relation itself is coextensive with alienated labor. So the idea of simply having equal wages, Proudhon's proposal, that, the idea that, the emancipation of labor is merely the kind of the equalization of wages, a fair wage for everyone, is completely inadequate and unsatisfactory, because it perpetuates this kind of the structural alienation, which is constitutive of the wage relation. And finally, this is why Marx writes in 14, general human emancipation is contained in the emancipation of laborers. It's contained within it because the whole of human slavery is involved in the relationship of the worker to his product. And all slave relationships are only modifications and consequences of this relationship. So this is why, you know, communism can only be understood as the abolition of wage labor as a kind of as a form of slavery. But then the question is it not? Is it also the kind of the abolition of labor as such? I think that Marx's answer will be yes, because it's the abolition of labor, of all value-creating labor, but all the uses that labor has generated in societies dominated by commodity production are indissociable from relations of commodification. So in other words, so again, it's not possible to give a positive characterization of what purely useful labor would be if wholly dissociated from valuable labor or wage labor. Okay. Now, okay, so now I'm just going to, so now we return to the German ideology. Okay, so I want to see the German ideology now. So Marx has a kind of a very interesting, it's one of the few places where he gives a kind of a characterization of communism in terms of the, you know, the overcoming of these, of the estrangements, of the set of estrangements that are coextensive with wage labor. So he writes, so that for instance, the estrangement of general interest and individual interest is the condition for the generation of the state. So he writes, just because individuals seek only their particular interest, which for them does not coincide with their common interest, the latter, i.e. the common interest, is asserted as an interest alien to them, and one independent of them, as in its turn a particular and distinctive general interest, or they themselves must remain within this discourse as in democracy. So what he's saying is that the distinction between the individual interest and the general interest, which is the precondition for the in a way the kind of the institution of the state. The state is there to reconcile the individual interest and the general interest. Okay, but this is itself, you know, a symptom of alienation. Okay, it's more of self-alienated labor. And in 16 he writes, the division of labor offers us the first example of the fact that as long as man remains in naturally evolved society, that is, as long as a cleavage exists between the particular and the common interest, as long therefore as activity is not voluntarily but naturally divided, man's own deed becomes an alien power opposed to him, which enslaves him instead of being controlled by him. For as soon as a division of labor comes into being, each man has a particular exclusive sphere of activity, which is forced upon him and from which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a shepherd, a critical critic, and must remain so if he doesn't want to lose his means of livelihood. Whereas in a communist society where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow. To hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, shepherd, or critic. So again, this is what's significant here is the claim that you know, what's the problem with the division of labor is that it allocates you know, specific tasks, you know, or in a way it kind of typifies productive activity according to social goals which are not, which in a way are stipulated by a ruling class, either by the state or the ruling class. So that, once again, productive activity becomes, it becomes stereotyped and reified in a way which inhibits, its full realization. And this is, in a way, this is what this does. It estranges the collective power of human producers, or collective social capacity, from our, individual capacities. So he writes in 17, this fixation of social activity, this consolidation of what we ourselves produce into a material power above us, growing out of our control, thwarting our expectations, bringing to naught our calculations, is one of the chief factors in historical development up until now. The social power, the multiplied productive force, which arises through the cooperation of different individuals, as it is caused by the division of labor, appears to these individuals, since their cooperation is not voluntary, but has come about naturally, not as their own united power, but as an alien force existing outside of them, of the origin and goal of which they are ignorant, and which they thus are no longer able to control, and which on the contrary passes through a peculiar series of phases and stages, independent of the will and the action of man, nay, even being the prime governor of these. So once again, yes, this is the social power, what he calls this multiplied productive force, presupposes cooperation. But in a way, the estranged labor, because it generates private property and therefore the division between the owner, the capitalist, and the worker, and the ensuing class stratification, it's, in a way, it mechanizes the structure of social cooperation, and it subordinates this cooperation to private interests, or to kind of to the interests of a particular or privileged class. So once again, this is simply yet another kind of manifestation of this estrangement, another consequence of the self-estrangement of productive activity. So therefore, that human productive activity generates a social structure to which it then becomes subordinated, and which prevents it from being, self-governing or autonomous. Okay, and now finally, yes.
Shall we make a pause?
Sorry. Yes. Would you like to have a? Yeah, we can have a pause. Yeah, and then there's just a couple more things on the handout I just want to go through, but we can pause now.
No. If you want to go.
Would people like to have a pause now, or to get to the end of the handout and then have a pause before the discussion?
Maybe let's do a pause.
Okay. Anyone else? Let me see. There's only, I think, okay, yeah, I think it's only one more page. Well, actually 3 pages, but I'll move quickly, so as we should be done in less than 10 minutes. Okay, so this is number 8, sorry, 18. Proletization as world historical. This is Marx. This estrangement can, of course, only be abolished given 2 practical premises. In order to become an unendurable power, a power against which men make a revolution, it must necessarily have rendered the great mass of humanity propertyless, and moreover in contradiction to an existing world of wealth and culture. And both these premises presuppose a great increase in productive power, a high degree of its development. And on the other hand, this development of productive forces, which at the same time implies the actual empirical existence of men in their world historical instead of local being, is an absolutely necessary practical premise, because without it, privation or want is merely made general, and with want, the struggle for necessities would begin again, and all the old filthy business would necessarily be restored. And furthermore, because only with this universal development of productive forces is a universal intercourse between men established, which on the one side produces in all nations simultaneously the phenomenon of the propertyless mass, or universal competition, making each nation dependent on the revolutions of the other, and finally puts world historical, empirically universal individuals in place of local ones. Now, okay, it's important because I think this is to connect up to kind of a point I was trying to make previously, is that I think that Marx's suggestion here is that in a way, it's the capitalist mode of production is what realizes the socialization of labor. In a way, it's the mass production and the creation of the world markets, and in a way, and the kind of the co-option of the entirety of humanity into the wage relation is precisely what the precondition for communism. Because it's under this, it's precisely the kind of it's under capitalism that the productive forces reach a kind of a pitch of development, which is historically unprecedented, and which obviously kind of brings about the kind of the systematic disempowerment of an entire class, the working class, who basically are obliged to kind of to work in order to live. So as the globalization draws the whole of humanity into the wage relation and brings about universal proletarialization. So the distinction there, so therefore the whole of humanity becomes structured in terms of the distinction between capitalists and proletarians, or capitalists and workers, between those who own the means of production and those who can only buy and sell things if they sell their labor. You have to sell their labor power to the capitalists in order to be able to buy what they need in order to exist. The claim here is that this kind of estrangement has to kind of, in a way, be radicalized, or has to kind of reach this kind of extremity. The proletariat has to kind of be reduced to having nothing but their labor power to sell in order for communism to be possible. So as in number 19, this is why he suggests that the world market is the world historical condition for the existence of communism. Communism understood as a real movement and not an ideal condition. He writes, the proletariat can thus only exist world historically, just as communism in its activity can only have a world historical existence. The world historical existence of individuals, i.e. the existence of individuals which is directly linked up with world history. Communism is for us not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement, which abolishes the present state of things. The conditions of this movement result from the now existing premise. So the now existing premise is capitalism, and the in a way the kind of the capitalist world market, which ushers in the proletarialization of the entire human population. And it's important. This is why it's a real movement. Communism is a real movement because the movement of estrangement, the dynamic of externalization and estrangement, reaches an extremity, which for Marx will kind of necessarily precipitate a transformation, a revolutionary transformation. And this is really, the quote number 20 is really just kind of, reiterating this claim. I just want to draw your attention to the kind of, towards the bottom of this passage where Marx writes, the communist revolution is directed against the hitherto existing mode of activity, does away with labor, and abolishes the rule of all classes along with the classes themselves, because it's carried through by the class which no longer counts as a class in society, which is not recognized as a class, and is in itself the expression of the dissolution of all classes, nationalities within present society. So it's precisely because proletarialization is the dissolution of every other positive determination, creates the class which has, which will, expropriate the expropriators, as Marx puts it, and abolish labor as such. Okay, which I think it's very important. We will do away with labor, and therefore by which I think he means, and because, as I've suggested, use-creating labor can be positively characterized in complete abstraction from value-creating labor under capitalist conditions. The communism is the abolition of labor. And in a way, the kind of the inauguration of, a kind of activity which can't be understood in terms of as labor has been understood up until now. Finally, he distinguishes also between three forms of communism. Crude communism is still governed by private property. This is number 21. So this is, Marx's critique of Proudhon, where he says that, communism isn't just the generalization of the category of the worker. It's not, communism is not making everyone work and equalizing wages. He says, as Marx puts it, this communism is merely the consistent expression of private property, which is just this negating the personality, which is to say the kind of, the unique productive capacity of each individual, insofar as it's commensurate with human species being. Crude communism is universal envy setting itself up as a power, and it's the concealed form of greed which merely asserts itself and satisfies itself in another way. The second form of communism is still political in nature, whether democratic or despotic, and B, with the abolition of the state, it abolishes the state, but it's still incomplete and still under the influence of private property. Now he doesn't, this is obscure. He doesn't elaborate on the contrast between the first and the second form of communism, but he says it is still imprisoned and contaminated by private property. It has understood its it has understood its concept, but not yet its essence. By which I think he means its essence as created by self-estranged labor. And finally, communism, you know, in the proper and the kind of the authentic sense, is the abolition of private property and of human self-alienation, but I think also the abolition of labor, the abolition of, in a way, the distinction between valuable labor and useful labor as we currently understand it. Okay, and then this is another very famous passage, but I just want to point, you know, I'll just read the section in bold. It's a genuine solution of the antagonism between man and nature and between man and man, the true solution of the struggle between existence and essence, between objectification and self-affirmation, between freedom and necessity, between individual and species. It is the solution to the riddle of history and knows itself to be this solution. The whole movement of history, therefore, both as regards the real engendering of communism, the birth of its empirical existence, and also as regards its consciousness and thought, is the consciously comprehended process of its becoming. This is why, you know, the movement of history is the consciously comprehended process of the becoming of communism. Okay, I'll stop here. Why don't we stop now? Have you know, a 5-minute break, and then maybe if we come back, I guess let's say at 10 to 7. Shall we start back at 10 to 7? Okay, yep, let's start back at 10 to 7.
No?
No?
Sorry, it was out.
It was out.
I was washing my hands.
Washing my hands.
Are we on pause?
Are we on pause? Yes, yes, we're having the break. We'll start back at 10 to 7.
Okay.
Okay,
Sorry.
sorry.
Hello? Hello? Can you hear me?
Hello?
Hello?
Yes, we hear you.
Yes, we hear you.
Yes?
Still on break.
Still on break.
Okay.
Okay.
Shall we start again?
Shall we start again?
I think there's still, I said until 10:02, so I think there's a couple more minutes to go.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever, you know, so I think some people might still be kind of taking a break.
I'm a bit overwhelmed by what's happening in Italy right now.
Oh, whoops! I haven't seen what is happening.
The fascists started shooting in a city in the market
Mm-hmm.
for racial motives.
Oh wow! No, I haven't seen the news.
It's on the Guardian.
Okay. Oh yes, I see. Yes.
Anyway, can I say something?
Yes.
In that passage of the German ideology, where you said all the old filthy businesses. Hello? Can you hear me? I can hear you. Where you said all the old filthy businesses. I think in the original version, it's all the old shit. which is, I mean, it's significant of the way Marx wrote his books, because he used a very colorful language. And it's also symptomatic of the way he treated capitalist society, because he treated it like the same old shit. It's something that is decomposing and that has to be overcome in order not to get decompose the human being. This is something that I wanted to say, just as a little particular about Marx. That's all.
I have a question, but I think I can't see your mouth, Dr. Brassier, but if you're talking, we can't hear you.
No, it's okay. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. So, I'm gonna go ahead and mute you again, so I'm not echoing. Okay. My question is, I'm wondering, from what I understand, Marx and Engels were rather hostile against socialist, communitarian, sort of communal living movements, and did not think that worker placed democracy would be good enough of an alternative to, to fix or ameliorate capitalism. But I'm wondering, when we talk about alienated labor, how to put this? There's unpaid labor. That's the surplus labor that creates a surplus value. The surplus value it always has to be unpaid, because some of that has to go into the research and development of the means of production, and obviously some of that goes into the capitalist pockets as well. But would it be true that if the worker was gaining ownership of the means of production, somehow, I don't know, there's probably different ways that this could be done, but they're slowly gaining ownership the longer they're in the company, could it be done in proportion to the wages they're not, or to the labor they're not being paid? And in that case, would it still be alienated? And I can rephrase that question if that doesn't make sense, but hopefully that's clear enough. And you're muted.
No, I was just saying, no, the question makes sense. I think I understand the question. About surplus labor and surplus value. Okay, so it's important that this is absolutely kind of central to Marx's entire account. In fact, it's what, exploitation is the extraction of surplus value from the wage relation. So that the point is that the worker necessarily creates more value than they are remunerated for when they enter into the wage relation. So this surplus labor, unremunerated labor, is a source of surplus value, which is the source of profit, which is absolutely kind of, in a way, the motor of it's the core of what Marx calls the valorization process. Capital's kind of self-valorization. However, this unpaid labor, it's unpaid wage labor, and it's unpaid commodified labor. And in that sense, remember, the labor that enters the labor from which surplus value is extracted is abstract labor, which is labor which is simply kind of measured in terms of socially necessary abstract labor time, and where abstract meaning that what you abstract from all the specific characteristics or qualities or skills that distinguish individual instances of concrete labor in reality. So in other words, so the labor that produces value, that generates value, is abstract and is necessarily abstract. So that means, so the second part of your question was, well, you said, well, if the workers, owned, let's say that they're the specific means of production, if they own, let's say, the factory, would they eliminate? Would they no longer be exploited? But in a sense, they would be exploiting themselves. The exploitation relation would no longer have, in other words, they would be performing in two different roles, okay? They would themselves be both capitalists and laborers. And in fact, that's a general condition now in kind of contemporary capitalist society, in that lots of people exploit their own labor. So they both act as laborers, as proletarians, and as capitalists, but they're still perpetuating the social arrangements and the social structures, which, for which exploitation is general. So in other words, I don't think the solution for Marx wouldn't be to get, it's not, the point is not, first of all, you can't, the socialization of the means of production means that you can't have any private ownership. So whether, whether it's a single capitalist or 100 workers, you still got kind of private ownership of the means of production. And more, even if the entire proletariat takes hold, appropriates the means of production, expels, expropriates the capitalist class, this kind of, this is still not the end of exploitation, because this is still property. And in a way, it's just generalized private property. So I think, as in the passage we just discussed, this is exactly what Marx thinks is wrong with what he calls crude communism. It wants to kind of, it doesn't understand the relationship between alienated labor and property and the wage form. And the abolishment of one entails the abolition of the others. So this is why, the socialization of labor and the collective ownership of the means of production is only the first step. The second step is, the abolition of wage labor, and therefore of private property. So I think, yeah, so in a way, I think that Marx thinks that these are, look, it's not, okay, I don't know, I'm not an expert on, Marx's relationship to, other, socialists and, anarchists, etc., and labor struggles. But I think that Marx's points, and, I think Marx thinks that kind of labor struggles are important, but he thinks that merely, obviously kind of the shortening of the working day, the institution of the 5-day working week, the kind of the raising of salaries, these are, you're merely palliating the symptoms, but you're not really treating you know, the cause, the root source of exploitation. So for him, of course, he's saying, you know, in a way, you have to kind of, you know, you shouldn't stop doing these things because, you know, so long as capitalism exists, there's a very real difference between, you know, mere exploitation and actual kind of, you know, miserable degradation. But the horizon, you can't simply operate on this level. You know, otherwise, you know, you can't give up on the revolutionary transformation, he thinks. So I think, I mean, you know, the relationship, as I understand it, I might be wrong about this, as I understand it, socialism is the kind of is a phase that will eventually ushers in communism, or is supposed to, but it's clearly not, you know, quite. It's not communism. So, however desirable socialism might be in the kind of the short term, it can't be a kind of you know, an end in itself, because because in a way it merely palliates this kind of general, you know, this well, what Marx here calls this kind of, you know, the self-estrangement of labor, but also exploitation. And one thing, exploitation for Marx is not oppression. Exploitation is a structural determination. You can be exploited no matter how much you get paid, or, you know, how few hours you work. It's just a characteristic. It's a structural characteristic of capitalist existence. And in this regard, you know, it's got nothing to do with, this is why, you know, alienation for Marx is not a kind of a psychological state. It doesn't, an exploitation can't simply be measured in terms of, you know, things like domination or repression, which is not to say that Marx doesn't want to kind of abolish domination and repression, but he thinks that, you know, abstract domination under capitalism is sometimes imperceptible and only works through exploitation, which, you know, exploitation can feel very nice. You know, you can be very happy and still be exploited and alienated in Marx's sense. And I think he thinks, so long as if you're only considering improving the lot of, you know, a segment of the population, then you're not engaged in, you know, communism understood as, you know, the you know, the project of human emancipation tout court, you know, without phase or qualification. I don't know if this answers your question. So I think, you know, these kinds of ventures, I mean, it would be, I think, silly and, you know, silly and kind of, you know, counterproductive to kind of object to them, but, you know, they have to be parts of a strategy, it seems to me. These kinds of, so, you know, workers taking control of their conditions of production is fine, very good, but it's only a kind of, surely it's only a kind of a, you know, can't be the ultimate goal.
So that all makes a lot of sense. Would you just say that the part of the reason it doesn't go far enough, though, is just because, you know, no business that operates in a capitalist system can be isolationist, right? You live in a fully globalized world where you are necessarily going to have to compete with other people who don't have to play nice. Oh, you're muted.
Yes, I think, you know, Marx wants to insist, you know, he thinks that capitalism is a totality. So it can only be understood as a kind of as a social totality. And he thinks that no, I mean, it was beginning to be true when he was writing, the world market was emerging, but now you effectively have a fully integrated world market where no aspect, no kind of fragments of the market can be kind of segregated or artificially segregated or kind of abstracted from any other. So that they're all interdependent, and all these circuits of commodity production and exchange and distribution, they're all interconnected and interdependent. So apart from the obvious things that the amounts of kind of mass-produced kind of goods that are manufactured in China now or in Southeast Asia, so that any commodity that you own depends on the wage labor of proletarians in other parts of the world, with whom you may never have come into contact in a way. But the point is that you are connected to them, because you're just, as soon as you buy and sell commodities, whether you're engaged in the kind of commodity production or commodity exchange, in a way you are embedded in these kind of relations of exploitation. And Marx's point is, he says, like, you can't grasp this phenomenologically. You have to kind of use the resources of abstraction to grasp the concrete social conditions which condition your daily activity. Everything you do on a daily basis, you're engaged in buying and selling commodities. From the moment you rise to the moment you go to bed, and even when you're sleeping, you can be kind of engaged in kind of commodity exchange. And the point is that all this this activity involves the realization, what he calls the exchange abstraction, the commensuration of all these different types and species of labor. And this is something that you're doing whether you independently of your psychological awareness or your or the kind of information that you you have access to. So I think this is why it's a point I was kind of trying to make last week, is that we don't know what it is we're doing in a capitalist society. We're engaged in exchanging and producing value and consuming kind of use values, but we don't really know what it is we're doing. And so that there's a kind of this structural unconscious that conditions our existence. And it's necessarily unconscious because it's social, and this involves a kind of a scale of complexity which is in a way kind of necessarily unfathomable and inaccessible at the personal or individual level. So this is why, and this is why the word revolution means a structural transformation for Marx. It's not, we'll see later on. This is why I think that the conditions under which there would be, a revolution now have changed fundamentally, and this is why it's not possible, I think, to kind of to conceive of it in using the scales, that were previously, in terms of previous political revolutions unfolded. You think of like a punctual event. You think of 1789 or 1917. The revolution that abolishes capitalism would I think take centuries. Not just years or decades, but centuries. So the question is, what kinds of is how does one kind of engage in a task of that magnitude? And yeah, I mean, I think that's the fundamental problem. Someone else want to, or I don't know if that was a satisfactory response.
That was great.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to ask something? Point of clarification, anything? I did want to say there's one short thing I wanted to say as a kind of summing up in terms of, like, you know, the content on today's time. So, you know, we started with this whole kind of alienation, you know, and then discuss kind of communism, or the ushering in of communism. And in the final quote, I mean, in quote 23, the final quotation on the handout. So I think, you know, this this kind of passage invites, I think, a conservative reading of Marx, where communism would be, you know, because it's the, he says, communism as the complete and conscious return of man, conserving all the riches of previous development for man himself as a social human being. Or when he talks about, you know, communism as the real reappropriation of the human essence by and for man. I think the temptation here is to think of alienation in metaphysical terms as being, so you have this kind of if labor becomes alienated, you know, under capitalism, and communism is the de-alienation of labor, then, you know, communism, as in this, I think this, as in the bad metaphysical readings of Hegel, is this kind of return or reunification or reintegration of a sundered, you know, of an organic unity or a wholeness that has somehow been split or sundered. But I think this is exactly what Marx doesn't mean, because I think, as I've said before, because labor, the essence of labor understood as useful or use-creating labor cannot be positively characterized in, an abstraction from specific, forces and relations of production. Okay, then, there's no such thing as, labor in itself, or an essence of labor, which is kind of estranged under capitalism and then is reunited and, reunified under communism. I think this is a kind of a bad metaphysical reading of Marx, which in a way naturalizes labor, as the essence of human existence. And I think Marx's point is that what he means, although he talks about reappropriation and return, what he means, it's that the I don't think it's not kind of reinstate. It's not the kind of the reestablishment of a unified essence. It's actually the kind of the initiation of the beginning of something unprecedented. It's actually it's the destruction of something that prevented this, human species being, or human productive capacity from actualizing itself, from being actual. So, and I think what he's saying is that it's never really existed, but capitalism, in a way, provides the conditions under which it can be brought into existence by negating the negation. So capitalism is the negation of this essence, this productive capacity, but it's a mistake to think that this productive capacity pre-exists its negation in and through capitalism. So the negation of the negation is actually what constitutes the the essence in understood as a kind of as a positive productive capacity. I mean, what the point I'm making here is a kind of basically Žižekian point. Okay, how the point for Hegel is that there's not what has been negated, in the allegedly initial negation, didn't pre-exist its negation, so that the negation of the negation is not the reinstatement of an originary state of affairs, this kind of this prelapsarian harmony, but it's actually the negation of a constraint, a negative determination of something that is only positively actualized through this this second negation, or negation of the negation. And this is what I think Marx means by communism. Communism is a determinate negation of capitalism, and capitalism is self-alienated labor, but Marx does not think that there was this originary kind of prelapsarian state where human beings existed in perfect harmony, where labor was in harmony with itself and with nature. I mean, I think that is a really bad metaphysical reading of Marx. And I think that his whole point, the reason why it's the history begins with communism, is because we don't yet know what human beings are capable of, and what human beings can actually create and produce. And capitalism gives us a negative inkling of what they can produce. But what has to be done is to kind of to destroy capitalism in order to to unleash this productive capacity, this unprecedented productive capacity, which capitalism has in a way prepared but also prevented. I think, yes, David has a quotation here. Yes, Marx himself says as much, I think. Do not let us go back to a fictitious primordial conditions, the political economist does when he tries to explain. So in other words, there is no unalienated labor is not like this originary, this kind of Edenic states, like, prior to the kind of, the fall. And I think that the problem that Marx has initially at this stage is that he can't help but kind of the very way in which he talks about labor, labor as both externalizing, self-externalizing, and self-estrangement, almost invites this, in a way, this hypostatization of labor, which for Marx is always embedded in a social relation. It's a kind of a set of what is labor? It's a set of productive practices which are always kind of socially embedded. And this is why, once again, just to reiterate the same point, that there is no domain of use in itself, because all the purposes which our practices seek to realize are always historically and socially mediated. And Marx is just saying that it's possible communism will usher in conditions under which practical conditions which do away with all the impediments to the previous social impediments to the realization of our practical capacities. There's a question here. Is it possible that the initial negation has the danger of being read in a metaphysical light as well? You mean the initial negation? You mean the like capitalism's negation of, in a way, of use creating labor? Is that what you have in mind? Yes, and in a way, if you think that capitalism, if one thinks that capitalism is eternal or necessary or has always already existed, then that's also a metaphysical kind of, you know, hypostatization. And you know, here this is the problem about, you know, kind of synchrony and diachrony. In that Marx is a historical materialist. He insists that there's a kind of, you know, the capitalist mode of production is one, you know, of a series. You know, there's a kind of a feudal mode of production, but the point is that there isn't, you know, as we said, I think last week, is that it's not simply, you can't simply string modes of production next to one another in a historical sequence. So the conditions under which capitalism emerges, you know, and Marx tries to say something about this in the discussion of primitive accumulation at the end of Volume 1 of Capital. Yes, you know, the emergence of capitalism is both a contingent historical accident. Okay, it's just something that came about through a kind of a specific concatenation of mechanisms and processes, but there's nothing ineluctable about it. On the one hand, that's what it means to be a historical materialist. Yet on the other hand, when you're analyzing the capitalist totality and the functioning of the capitalist totality, you can't separate any moment of the structure from any other. So like labor, so for instance, in the distinction between you know, use value and exchange value, well, the point is that use value is also kind of, you know, kind of encompassed by the capitalist totality. So in other words, you can't talk about use value in complete abstraction from exchange value and from, you know, the from capitalism, and that means so then the danger then is, you know, can you do this then without eternalizing, you know, kind of capital? And I think, yes, you can, if you're clear that you're giving a structural analysis. I mean, structural, not in a narrowly Althusserian sense, but structural in the sense that it's a kind of a synchronic, you're treating, as Marx himself puts it at the beginning of Volume 1, he's dealing with a kind of an idealized, you know, he's disregarding lots of kind of, you know, empirical details and specificities, and he's just trying to kind of construct this, the basic functioning, or the, you know, to catalog, you know, the capitalism's general laws of motion, and I think you can do this without, you know, doing metaphysics, precisely because you understand, precisely insofar as you understand. And this is why I think you need to hold on to this idea that all of this vast impersonal machinery, the valorization process, is still conditioned by practical activity, by what human beings do. And I think that this is the key to kind of, in a way, to not kind of ontologizing capitalism in the way in which arguably even some value theorists do. To maintain this distinction between, you know, I think between the reality of the act and the actuality of the form determination. Okay, so if the act of exchange is at the core of capitalism, well, the reality of the act of exchange, which is something, you know, done by human beings, is independent, you know, and distinct from the actuality of the exchange form, or exchange, which mediates, all human activity. So this is something I think this is a very important issue, actually. Okay, Meredith has a question. I don't know what non-alienated labor could even look like. Unless all labor is performed by robots or automated, is this psychological? We must understand that we are alienated. Well, yes, in the sense that I think that when Marx talks about, look, in a sense, all labor is externalization. Okay, so there is no labor that doesn't involve externalization. Not all externalization entails, is self-estranging. So all estrangement presupposes externalization, but not all externalization leads to estrangement. But the point is that the externalization, you can't give, what does he mean by externalization? He means the creating of something useful. Okay? Human beings do stuff, they make things that they want or need. But again, his point is that what human beings want or need can't be, there's no eternal catalogue of natural human wants and needs. That's metaphysics, if you think that. He thinks that this is what political economists end up doing. He just says that the specific, any positive characterization of the wants and needs that are kind of generated by human activity will be historically specific. And I think that's all he means, I think, by I think what he means, by unalienated labor is labor or productive activity that is autotelic, that is not subordinated to the creation of value. Very simply, okay, that's all he means. So also, unless all labor is performed by robots and automated, well, actually, there's a distinction. Marx has a discussion. Remember, Marx distinguishes instruments from machines, or tools from machines. And in a way, there's a limit to the automation of labor, in a sense that you can automate parts of the labor, the production process, but you can't fully automated labor is oxymoronic for Marx, because there's no wage relation, because you don't pay a machine, and if you don't pay the machine, you can't extract surplus value from it. You can't exploit a machine because you don't need to pay it, and if you don't need to pay it, you can't extract surplus value from it. So this is why there's a limit to automation, which is guaranteed by the capital relation.
Not machines that electricity. I don't mean to be silly.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, I'm afraid what I'm saying is a joke, but I totally mean it seriously. Is there no way in which we are paying machines, or even speculatively that we may end up paying machines? And then I was just thinking about, well, look at, obviously they need to be powered, just as we need money to buy food, we need to pay for electrical production in order for machines to be fed. So just wondering if that could be complicated in any way, what you stated. Oh, I think you're muted.
No, it definitely can be complicated, and you're right to point out the complication. Now, I mean, what do you have in mind when you explain, when you say we pay machines? That what exactly do you mean when you say that there are machines that we pay?
Well, I mean, I am thinking more speculatively. May even be considered conscious, or may somehow you know, philosophers, AI speculate the potential for self-conscious AI, and then thinking about those being working within a capitalist system.
Okay, but then I think you have to be careful here, because look, the distinction between the human and the machine has got nothing to do with consciousness or any qualitative characteristic. I mean, most human labor is moronic, okay, and that's the whole point about kind of abstract labor. By decomposing labor into kind of discretely kind of simple kind of functions. Think of like an assembly line. The labor being produced on an assembly line by an assembly line worker is like completely like moronic. Like there's nothing. There's no kind of property or characteristic of the worker that distinguishes her labor from the operation of a machine. And in fact, Marx explicitly says that human beings become machine parts. They become tools. They become parts of a machine. They become components of a machine. But the point is, even these components of the machine, okay, still need to be paid. If you eliminate, they still need to be paid, because if you don't, I think this is going to kind of sound a bit, actually, this is actually a very, difficult point, and I don't know if it actually kind of, makes sense or kind of, but I think that in Marx's account, I think, Marx distinguishes famously between living labor and dead labor. And again, but what he means by living labor is not the distinction is not that living labor is human and dead labor is automated or machinic. Living labor can be as, punitively kind of moronic or mindless as you want, but it's just necessary in order to actualize the conversion the conversion of commodities into money. Okay, so that it intervenes it's necessary in the production process, because what you're doing is, when you're producing commodities, you're producing something that can be sold, but you're producing for something that can be sold at a profit, and its production must also be profitable. So in other words, that you must, the labor that is, bought in the production process must, be cheap enough to ensure the generation of surplus value. The idea that you must make a profit when you sell the commodities. And in a way, that's, I think the role of living labor in Marx is just to kind of, to convert, in a way, to mediate between what he calls fixed capital and variable capital to secure surplus value and profits. Fixed capital is the capital invested in the means of production, the instruments of production. Variable capital is the wage, okay? But the whole point about paying someone to contribute to the production process is to ensure that you can, make a profit and sell the commodity at a price that is greater than the cost of manufacturing it, including the cost of the wage. And so I think that if you automate the entire production process, which is to say if you eliminate living labor in that sense, then it's not clear where surplus value is going to come from. So I think, I think all of Marx's distinctions, there are structural and formal distinctions. And I think that, as we'll see when we look at, everything, capitalism is just about the extraction of surplus value. The whole account is the crux of the entire account. This is how the reproduction of capital is miraculously kind of, an amplification, an augmentation. Capitalism must reproduce itself in a way that ensures its augmentation or its increase. How can it do this? It can do this. This is why it needs the laborer, because it needs the wage relation to be enforced so that the laborer sells her labor at less than the price for which the commodity that she is producing will eventually be sold on the market. Now, this involves like some economic arguments actually, which get very complicated, okay? And it may be that there are counter arguments to be made at the economic level. But I think the critique of the theory of, in other words, it seems to me that these debates about automation, I mean, it's not really about humans versus machines. It's really about the extraction of surplus value and about the economic dynamics involved in extracting surplus value, and whether it's possible to extract surplus value without the wage relation, basically. The wage relation is something where you sell, again, you're selling something to the capitalist. The capitalist is buying something that you can do, but in a way, the qualitative features of your activity are entirely irrelevant. Like, it doesn't really matter. And the point is that everything that human beings can and will be automated. The question is whether that won't just kind of terminate the valorization process. Meredith has two comments. Google extracting flu epidemiological data from aggregating all search and geographic data related to flu queries. I think you can extract surplus value from machines due to emergent effects. Emergence, maybe my understanding of surplus value is lacking, so from a capitalist perspective, I hire workers and extract surplus value from the product. Yes, I mean, obviously, what is surplus value? It's simply that it's unpaid, that the worker must sell her labor at a price that is less than the price for which the capitalist will eventually sell the commodity. So effectively, the labor is the baseline for the labor must make enough money in order to reproduce her own labor. Okay, in other words, so labor constantly re-enters onto the market in order to reproduce itself. In other words, why do you work? You work in order to kind of make money to feed, to find food, clothing, and shelter. That would be the minimum. Okay, but the cost of food, clothing, and shelter, okay, which is the cost, the defaults, at which you're kind of the baseline against which you're going to measure I guess the viability of the wage will always be less than what the cost of the commodities produced by that labor itself. I think that's that's the simplest definition. So this is why I'm not sure. So Meredith, when you say you can extract surplus value from machines due to you can use machines. I mean, can you clarify exactly what you mean here? You mean you can use machines to kind of? Does this mean using machines as part of a kind of a larger process of manufacturing or designing or engineering a commodity? Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Shall I just read what Meredith has written here? Okay, yes, I'll just read what Meredith has written here. So say I start my own Twitter and I have an AI that goes through all the Twitter statements to create predictive information about anything. Aside from my initial labor going into building the original AI, I am getting extra value out of that process. Okay, but then do you mean, but you'd be able to sell the information? Okay, if you get you create predictive information, but that information must be sold. Okay, and then you can kind of, if you sell the information, and presumably, so if the information then, when you sell the information, you sell it at a price higher than the costs incurred in creating it. But that's just profit, though. I'm not sure that that's surplus value. According to, okay, I mean, so Marx thinks that ultimately all profits can be rooted back, can be traced back to surplus value. But he doesn't think that they're the same thing. So in other words, you can make a profit on a transaction. You can always, buy something cheaper than, the price at which you sell it, and you can make a profit. That's not surplus value. Surplus value comes in the production of a commodity. And so when you make the AI, if the commodity here is the AI, so you produce the AI, but then you'd have to be selling the AI, not just the information. In order for, if we're talking about surplus value, you'd have to be, selling, not just the information generated by the AI, but the the AI itself. There's another comment here. Also, the laborers of the company Twitter have their own alienated labor, managing the system on which the AI operates. Can you just say a little bit more, just to elaborate a bit, exactly what you mean?
Sure. I just wanted to. One second. Sorry, Ray, I'm muting you. I just wanted to elaborate just on that statement, to remember that the processes that we currently work with, for example, the internet is built on a capitalist, platform as well, and there are laborers who are hidden behind these, internet companies on which you can create an AI like Twitter. Just a side point that the labor goes back. It's not just one creates the AI and it works just on its own. Just a side point. You're muted too, Ray.
No, that's a very good point. Thanks. That's a very good point. And Meredith says tech laborers are alienated.
I just wanted to follow up.
Sure. Yes.
This for me is just trying to think really concretely about what it is, but actively with regards to automation. Ray. That
I'm having difficulty hearing you.
Yeah, sorry. The feedback thing. Unfortunately, I think the whole muting, unmuting thing is unfortunate. But can you hear me now? Okay, you're muted for a second. That's okay. What I was gonna say is, I think if I'm following along correctly, we're still riffing on this idea of pretty much all of this, what you called moronic labor, will be automated at some point, or all labor perhaps will be, in the Marx critical sense, will be automated at some point. So what will society look like at that point? And then, as I think Meredith was pointing out, there's still going to be people having to manage these machines, this system, the technology. So there's always going to be this class structure, so long as capitalism sticks around as it is. But nonetheless, it does make me wonder and speculate a little bit as to whether, when this happens, when pretty much all labor is automated, and there's been some articles, just pop articles that come out talking about what kinds of labor can't be automated, certain kinds of creative endeavors. So in the best case scenario, let's just say everything that's not automated, all labor that's not automated, is creative labor. And even though that's still a form of exploitation, it's a lot better than what we have now. It's maybe not quite as moronic as a lot of things that people have to do to make money. So is there any way, this is a really bad question, I'm so sorry, but is there any way that we'll have some kind of realization of what Marx would ideally want as a substructure within this capitalist system, where the kind of in this division on the side of this hardcore capitalism, what you have is really the people managing the machines, and then underneath that you have a new kind of society which is primarily creatively driven? That's pretty much my question. I realize it's a bit broad and weird.
So yeah, you said you'd have most, so kind of almost maximal automation of labor, and then you just have a kind of a class, or people kind of supervising, I guess, the machines or the operations of the machines.
Maybe that could be collective. Everybody takes their turn. We all know how to fix machines and make art.
Okay, but is the idea that these everything that all forms of manual labor, or even all forms of kind of manual and intellectual labor that are that people are forced to do now, but don't really want to do, would be automated. So therefore, people would be left free to kind of, as you said, to kind of create.
Or do nothing.
Yes, but then the question is, okay, I mean, the question is, who owns the machines? And does anyone, I mean, do they carry out these tasks? Does no one own the machines?
I think it's looking
what
like
about the costs?
I think it's going to be owning all the machines. That's where I could start. The Amazon.
Okay. Look, these are very interesting, very interesting questions. In a way, I'm not, I'd need to, I confess I'm kind of, I simply don't know enough about, the contemporary economy to give, very informative answers to them. I think they're the right questions to ask. But I think that the question, the fundamental questions, to bear in mind from Marx's point of view is simply, who owns what? Is something being bought and sold? And is someone making a profit? And as far as the creative, as being, as far as this kind of, you said, like, what about, if all kind of drudgery, all undesirable labor is automated, so people really are left free to kind of, to more or less do what they want. Could they create? But the point is that the horizons of creativity are socially constrained. So even if, even machines did, all the kind of the manufacturing, the kind of material manufacturing, but even, I guess, even the kind of the intellectual manufacturing that is, the condition of contemporary society, even if all of that was automated, so that people didn't have to kind of, go out and, get paid to do it. So what would people do? Well, they might create, but the point is that the horizons of the creative imagination are also socially constrained for Marx, and they're going to be constrained by, if there's a distinction between, I guess because the material structure of society reflects, what kinds of things do what, or what kinds of functions and tasks are executed, reflects social relations which are tied to property and class. So the question, I think, the question is like, would property is, would you still have abolished? Would you have abolished property and class? Because Marx thinks that those are the ultimate determinants of the social imagination. That's an open question. I think, I don't know, and actually this is where the empirical details are very, I don't think these questions can be, speculatively adjudicated.
Sorry.
Yes, I think we have to stop.
We need to finish as soon as possible.
Okay. Any final questions? Okay, maybe we should, it seems a good place to stop for this week. Okay, thanks, and
okay.
we'll carry on next week.
Thank you.
Okay.